Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. This is our third week of our series called God is Proud of You, where we're talking about pride, what it is, what it's not, what's good about it, and when it's bad. Today we're reflecting on the calling of Gideon in Judges chapter 6. There is a phrase that has entered into our cultural lexicon in the last few years that I've come to love/hate. It's imposter syndrome. I'm sure you've heard it, right? Imposter syndrome is a way of naming that feeling that so many of us have that we are not qualified for the position that we've been granted or to which we've been promoted or something like that, right? So maybe you've been at your company for 10 years and you get finally promoted to some kind of position and you think to yourself, I'm a fraud. I don't know how to do this. I don't have the skills or the qualifications to be in charge of this new level of project or have all of these responsibilities or be responsible for these people. Maybe you earned a degree and you're thinking to yourself, how did I actually get this? Like they're saying that I am a doctor now or a master or a bachelor or whatever. They're going to give me the rights and responsibilities with this degree. Doesn't everyone know that I have no idea what I'm doing? And we feel like an imposter. We feel like everyone else who is at that same level as us has something figured out, some essential piece of knowledge that we don't, and so we allow it to paralyze us. I'm so glad that we have a name for it now, imposter syndrome, because I think until we were able to name it, it was an experience that so many of us had, but no one was able to put a name to. And so we just kind of assumed we were the only ones like that. And it caused us to shy away from or shrink back from work that is important to do in the world. Oftentimes work that God has created us and gifted us and called us to. And so because we're in a series about pride and because in the last couple of months we've been talking about calling and how to make real change in the world, I thought it was important for us to talk about the kind of pride that manifests itself as false humility, the kind of false humility that imposter syndrome names. And that's why I love the story of Gideon's call. This is the book of Judges, which is a time in Israel's history where they were constantly being conquered and oppressed by neighboring peoples. And so when that would happen, God would select an individual, appoint them as a judge, often gift them with power to rise up, lead their people to cast off their oppressors. This happens over and over and over again in the book of Judges. And Gideon's call is interesting because they're being oppressed by the Midianites, and Gideon is so afraid of them that he is threshing grain, which again, we don't have to go into all the science of that, right? But he's basically farming, but he's doing it in secret. He's hiding because he doesn't want the oppressors to know how much food he has, because they'll take it from him, right? And he's trying to feed his family, he's trying to feed his community, and so he's hiding in secret, doing this farming, this kind of food prep, and an angel of God appears and hails him as a mighty warrior. And again, I just want you to let the comic weight of that greeting land on you. This guy who is so afraid of his oppressors that he is doing this in secret is hailed by an angel of God as a mighty warrior. You can feel the imposter syndrome in Gideon's response. He's like, you've surely got the wrong person if you came here looking for a mighty warrior, right? And yet God affirms again and again to Gideon throughout his call story that he is the one that God has selected to be a judge. Even to the point, again, this is a part of the story you may be more familiar with. Gideon is so self-conscious about his ability to lead that he says, okay, I'm going to give God a couple of tests, where he lays out a sheepskin and he says, okay, when I wake up in the morning, I want the ground around it wet, but it dry. And God's like, sure, whatever. And then the next night he's like, okay, but now I want it wet and the ground around it dry. And God keeps affirming Gideon's calling, doing these things to assuage his imposter syndrome. But what I think is staggering about Gideon is that in comparison to the judges that came before him, he is viewed sort of as a failure for this. His imposter syndrome is not celebrated and lauded. In fact, I think it's weird when Christian leaders will use the idea of throwing out a fleece as a thing that a faithful person should do so that God can prove God's faithfulness to us. Because when Gideon does it, it's seen as a marker of a lack of faith. Because God has already told Gideon that Gideon is called to be a judge. God has already declared that Gideon is a mighty warrior. So God doesn't have anything left to say about this. It's only Gideon's own lack of self-confidence that keeps him dragging his feet towards getting on board with God's liberation work. Now, I say all of this because I think when we're talking about pride, it's easy for us to think that pride is being arrogant. So we would look at someone with imposter syndrome and say, well, they're obviously not prideful. How could they be? They're the opposite of arrogant. They don't have enough self-confidence, so they're not proud. But if you remember how we talked about pride last week in our Beacon bit, we saw that pride is not just arrogance. Arrogance is one way that pride can manifest, but pride is actually setting ourselves up as the final judge and the arbiter of what is true, and refusing to acknowledge God's vision of the world. So when Gideon looks at God's messenger and says, I'm not a mighty warrior, he's actually acting in pride because he is rejecting God's assessment of the situation in favor of his own. He's essentially doing the same thing that the man and the woman in the garden did when they ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this sort of false humility is actually a manifestation of pride. When we have a clear calling from God or a clear mandate to go into the world and do good, whether that's in our occupations or our vocations or in our homes or in our community or whatever, when we know what we have been called to do and we decide we don't have what it takes, that is an exercise of pride. Because it is not up to us to decide whether we have what it takes or not. It's up to God. So this week in our Beacon gatherings, we're going to be talking about false pride. We're going to be talking about how it manifests and what it looks like. We're going to be talking about how we can spot it and how hard it can be to reject it, but why we need to for the sake of God's calling. I look forward to this conversation, and I hope that your time between now and then is filled with God's presence in a special way, that you hear God's calling on your spirit, and that you can reject the spirit of false humility that can well up within us.